On May 18th, the Ralph Chesse Memorial Exhibit, put together by Kate Patterson, Glenn Helfand, and the staff of the San Francisco Main Library on Larkin Street, opened successfully to a large invited audience, and it has been absolutely an amazing effort from all concerned. I'd like to encourage everyone to visit that exhibit before it closes on August 18th, 2024. It's my hope that the exhibit would be able to focus on my father's 70-year body of work, which ran from 1920 to 1980 before he retired to Oregon for the last 10 years of his life. Unfortunately, much of what he produced has never been shown publicly until this year, thanks to Kate Patterson and the museum staff. However, due to spatial considerations, the museum was not able to present even a third of what he produced. So this particular film that we're going to be doing now is going to try to cover those years in San Francisco from 1920 to 1955. And I would intend to show that my father was a very unique person and probably the most important artist to be on the San Francisco scene for those 70 years. The French Quarter in New Orleans in 1906 was the center of the Chesse family universe. They had a house on the corner of Burgundy and Kellerick near Esplanade in the Faubourg Marigny. The family home was built by Simon Esnard in 1830. On his death, my father's grandmother, Rosa Esnard, inherited the building. On my grandfather's father's death, the mother, Rosa, had the whole family move in with her. She died in 1907, and they lived in this house until 1928, when it was sold and the whole family moved to San Francisco. When Ralph first met Blanding Sloan in San Francisco in 1921, he was introduced to the art of wood linoleum block printing and etching. He lived in Sloan's North Beach Art Center, which was jerry-built from temporary housing left over from the 1906 fire and earthquake. My mother followed him to San Francisco in 1926, and while she was there, they decided to make a cross-country trip to New York and eventually got married there. While there, he worked for Aline Bernstein at the neighborhood playhouse and saw for the first time the Moscow Art Theater, the Ballet Russe, O'Neill's Emperor Jones, and the work of the American puppeteer Remo Buffano. All this became major influences in his artistic life. Fresh back from New York, he was challenged by Sloan to create a marionette production of Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones, which he followed up with another production, Shakespeare's Hamlet, which enabled him to play lead parts in many of the major classical plays that would have eluded him due to his small physical stature. In these initial marionette shows, he gave jobs to all his sisters and brother, and each in turn found a husband and wife, which again changed their focus and broadened their lives. New Orleans was now behind them. This also gave his sisters Vonnie, Ding, and Leslie an opportunity to branch out into other performing areas. In 1930, my grandfather and grandmother bought a house on the Russian River in a place called Camp Meeker. This became a summer residence for all the family from the time we were young children up until we were entering high school. During the 30s, my father opened over 4 different marionette theaters and did such productions as The Mikado, Don Juan, Alice in Wonderland, in which they traveled and toured in this wonderful truck. He also did a production of The Crock of Gold, which was an Irish story about leprechauns, which was very successful. As well as doing marionette shows, my father was painting. And they would have, every year, would have San Francisco Art Association would have an exhibit. In his spare time as well, he did roles on stage in exchange for a variety of design work that he would do for the theater companies that he worked with. In 1935, was a very pivotal year for my father, because that's when the WPA was created. And he was appointed director for the Marionette Theater Project of the Federal Theater for San Francisco. And he started out doing marionette variety shows, which were always introduced by one of his special characters, George Bernard Shaw. Well, this was very successful, and he also did a number of regular marionette shows, which he brought back from what he was doing in the 30s. But in 1937, there were some problems down in Los Angeles, and he was sent down to take care of those problems. And he was now made managing director for the Federal Theater Marionette Theater Project for all of California. And here we see a picture of his entire Los Angeles crew. My father, when he got down to Los Angeles, he wanted to do full-length productions, and the Los Angeles puppeteers were very stuck on doing variety shows. So he brought his old variety show from San Francisco to spice it up a bit. The conductor now became Arturo Toscanini. And the way my father set up the show and created the symphony behind Toscanini was to have shadow puppets in the background. So he was conducting to these shadow puppets. The Walt Disney animators began to show up at the performances. They were copying and drawing the Toscanini and the shadow characters. Now, a little later on, Fantasia came out, And my father always insisted that Walt Disney stole that idea from him. In 1939, my father was transferred back to San Francisco to perform at the San Francisco World's Fair, where he did a production of Pinocchio. And we moved to a place called Uranus Terrace. And these are some views from the house. This is my sister and I and my mother at the very tender age of about 4. I always like to revisit the house on Uranus Terrace, and here's a picture of me standing in front of it. It was a very exciting house. It was large, and it had a big front yard. It had a big backyard, and the interior was pretty interesting as well. Here we see the upstairs of 26 Uranus Terrace, where my father had his art studio. And this is the art studio. He had a complete view of San Francisco, and it was a very productive time for him. He did over 50 paintings. In 1930, my Uncle Roland got my father a berth on his transport ship, and he did a tour of the Far East, picking up soldiers in New York and coming back through the Panama Canal and going to Manila and other points in the Far East. During the late 30s and 40s, my father began to do a whole series of paintings around black imagery. Some religious, where here we see the flight to Egypt. This is a picture of Susanna and the Elders. It was quite startling in one respect, but the thing that's so exciting about it is the fact that he now represents very strong black women. Here we see Jacob and the Angel, a family scene in New Orleans. And here is another departure. This could be seen as Hamlet with the skull of Yorick, or it could be the gravedigger in Hamlet. It has an ambiguity to it, which is very interesting. My father, all during the war, worked in the marine shipyards. This was a picture from the marine shipyards. Interestingly enough, this became something of a controversy because it was part of an exhibit of paintings that was sent to Russia on the Lend-Lease program, and they disappeared. None of these paintings, which were done by a lot of the muralists from the Coit Tower, never surfaced again. They're lost somewhere in Russia. This is a painting that I gave to Simon Callow, and it's a very iconic picture. It's a picture of backstage, it was done in 1935, of a dressing room for a production of Volpone. And all the people in this picture were real. They were WPA actors. And one of the things about the WPA is that the little theater groups formed in the WPA went on to have longer lives than the WPA. This group of people worked until 1955. This is a picture of my sister and I. It's the only portrait that my father did of us as children, and I'm very attached to this one. It has a lot of meaning to me because it is one of the most positive statements he made about my sister and I as children. The post-war 50s was to be the most important years for my father. In 1952, he ventured into television with a program called Baron Woodley and His Friends on Channel 4, broadcasting from the old Sutro Mansion on Twin Peaks. Baron Woodley would interview famous characters from stories and fairy tales like Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. In 1952, the show was then canceled abruptly. Following the show, my father was hired by the Latham Foundation for the Promotion of Humane Education to create a marionette show devoted to understanding animals and the environment. It was developed for KPIX as part of the Captain Fortune children's television program. Brother Buzz was a 20-minute marionette show based on stories by Dolores Wilkins Kent. The program ran from 1952 through 1969. Remarkably, My father was responsible for all elements of the production, starting with writing the scripts, designing the marionettes, and playing the majority of all the character parts, with both my brother and I playing Brother Buzz and Letty Connell Schubert playing Busy Bee, and taking on all the female parts as well. It was the longest sustaining children's program on the West Coast, lasting 17 years longer than Howdy Doody. It stood the test of time and became very iconic for its use of the environment and animals. Brother Buzz allowed my father at 53 to have a steady income, making possible his going to Europe for the first time in 1956. It brought him back to painting on a full-time basis, allowing him to pursue many directions with respect to his life and art. 1956 was pivotal to changing the course of his life, as well as mine. It enabled both of us to make choices that were to have a profound effect on our realizing who we were as artists. For my father, it was a motivating factor in allowing him to take his painting to another level by exploring new forms and broadening his use of color and subject matter. It gave him a freedom of expression that had eluded him in many ways in previous years. It allowed him to come into his own by giving himself permission to step away from some of the fears that haunted him. After 56 and many more trips to Europe, his artistic palette began to reflect a diversity of color and style. Still working figuratively, we still see the influences of the Impressionists like Cézanne, Monet, Manet, Rouen, Gauguin, and the stained glass reflections of the church windows. In addition, his palette begins to reflect the color of European cities he was visiting on each trip. On all his trips, he returned with numerous sketchbooks, with color notations and numerous photographs which were to give him ideas for paintings. Much of his diversity came from what he was seeing and experiencing. His painting becomes more abstract, including landscapes and wandering representational abstracts. Figuratively, the turmoil of the late 60s began to have its effect on my father. We lived in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, and the hippie generation began to change that neighborhood, and what was happening there and in the Castro, where we had lived during the 40s and early 50s, began to change. And change was always a problem for my father. He was fascinated with the freedom expressed by the hippie generation, but repulsed by their loose morals, and in one sense, he subconsciously was envious of their lack of conformity. The 60s through the 70s and the 80s also brought ideas anew. My cousins Peter Albin and Rodney Albin, associated with Big Brother and the Holding Company, the rock group, and Janis Joplin, would take him to these rock concerts, which gave him more ideas for painting. In 1967, he was invited to exhibit at the Walter Moore Gallery in San Francisco with the rock and roll poster artwork of Wes Wilson, Rick Griffin, Stanley Mouse, Alton Kelly, and Victor Moscoso. In 1979, my father returned to Shakespeare with marionettes. With a grant of $5,000 from Doug Laird, who was a fisherman from Prince Rupert, Canada, I was able to produce a marionette production of Macbeth. My father built all the marionettes and designed the sets and props. My brother took on the chore of directing. I played Macbeth, Dion Macduff, and my father played King Duncan and the Porter. The production opened at the University of San Francisco's College Theater and was transferred to the San Francisco Aquarium Theater near the DeYoung Museum in Golden Gate Park. Later that year, in 1980, I encouraged my father and brother to move to Ashland, Oregon, where they could live more cheaply. My father was very moved by the Oregon countryside, and he turned once again to landscapes and to his black roots. It was there that he and my brother mounted their last classical marionette production of Molière's The Doctor in Spite of Himself. In 1991, after 3 or 4 strokes, my father succumbed of old age, And ironically, my brother died 4 months after him of lymphoma.